Good morning and welcome back to another day of discipleship training and reflection on the passage from Luke chapter 4 verse 18. This is Jesus coming to the synagogue. It's his first public ministry in the Gospel of Luke. He'd been doing other ministry around, yes, in public, but this is where he really makes a statement of what he's about. And that's what we've been focusing on this passage, and we're going to continue to do it through Mark, Matthew, and John as well. What did Jesus focus as the theme in that gospel? How did he frame what he was going to be about doing? Because I think when we learn that, we get to see what are the things we are supposed to be about doing as disciples. So Luke chapter 4, verse 18 says, "He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, and that the oppressed will be set free." We already did the good news to the blind and good news to the poor in the first part of that, and bind up the brokenhearted. But here he says that he is to sent me to proclaim that the captives will be released and that the oppressed will be set free. We're going to come back to the blind, we'll see, as well as finish up the rest of the verse later. But what we see here is that they are to be released. Literally, in the Greek, it's both released and set free are the same word. It's the word for delivered. Somebody on the outside will come in and take them out of their situation and make it possible for them to leave. To be free, to be released. The captive, the word there carries the connotation of a prisoner of war, taken at the point of a spear. And the oppressed carries the connotation of those that have been broken, shattered, bruised. That is, that they have been pushed down by society. So we need to ask ourselves a couple questions here as we look at this. First of all, what are we captive to and what are we oppressed by? That is, what is it that takes us captive that needs Jesus to set us free? And what is it that oppresses us or others that needs to be changed? What is it that we feel we need to be delivered from or want to be delivered from? And perhaps even more important, what is it that God sees that we need to be delivered from? And obviously, when we look at what Jesus did in his life, we begin to see these things that he felt were important to deliver us from and to set us free from. Now, obviously, the first and the most spiritual answer that we're going to have, and the one that we're going to run to most of the time, first off, particularly in our context and culture of version of Christianity, is that we need to be set free from sin. That sin takes us captive, takes our heart captive, our soul captive. It oppresses us by leading us down a road. And by our choice, and the circumstances of life, we know that we all are sinful. So we all do need to be set free from that. We are oppressed by sin, we are captivated by sin, and we know that Jesus came to set people free from their sins. We also can say that very similar to it is that there is a spiritual captivity, there is spiritual oppression. Now, in Jesus' day, they saw that most clearly as demonic possession, and we see Jesus casting out demons on a somewhat regular basis. It's not an uncommon thing for him to do. And while we wouldn't necessarily talk about that in the same way in all circles today, it is something that still exists. But we would reflect more of it on addictions, generational dysfunction that binds us and holds us, some of the psychological things that hold people back. But there is this spiritual warfare that goes on, this war between good and evil is trying to take people and control them. So there is a spiritual captivity, and Jesus clearly sets people free from that. There was physical sickness. Jesus came and brought healing to people because they were sick. Whether it's an issue of blood, whether it is leprosy, whether it is a smaller thing, Jesus regularly healed. He was known as a healer, and he sent his disciples out to heal. We need to be set free from physical sickness. That is something that does oppress people. But in Jesus' day, there was also religious oppression. There were the laws and rules that functioned to keep the temple funded. And all the rules and the laws that were added were things that kept people separated because they could not, in many cases, the poor people could not afford to participate in the religious activities of the temple or travel there. And therefore, they were marginalized and excluded. The way the Pharisees conducted themselves was to set a higher standard to the law, which in their mind made them more pure and holy, but it also put rules and regulations that Jesus says oppress people. There was systemic injustice. There was corruption in the judges, and bribes were taken. We see this from the Old Testament all the way to the New. Jesus is not the first one to come as a prophet and speak out against the systemic injustice that oppressed people and held them captive in a system where the rich made the rules and the poor were subject to unfair judgments against them. There was economic oppression. Frequently, we see Jesus speaking out against the economic oppression that is part of the temple. But in society as a general, it was a very stratified society with a very high percentage of people that were on the bottom and people on the top that controlled. Now, certainly with the Roman Empire, slavery and the other things were a typical part of that kept people oppressed. But we see economic oppression as saying that Jesus is often fighting against. Think of Zacchaeus returning the money that he has stolen and multiplying that. And he says salvation has come. Why? Because some economic oppression has been overcome. But there was also exclusion of people from the fellowship. Gentiles were frequently excluded. While we know Gentiles did become Jews, they had to go through all sorts of hoops to do that. And so there's all sorts of questions about, is the faith for the Gentiles? Women were seen as property and did not have a place. And yet we see Jesus elevating women. They're a central part to his ministry. And they're actually the first preachers. They're the first ones to go to the tomb and proclaim the resurrected Lord. And so there's a lot that Jesus does with the women in changing their status. But there's also the social outcasts. We might think of the lepers that he heals. We might think of the tax collectors and others that were on the margins of society. And how often is Jesus criticized because he hung out with those people on the margins? All those are different forms of oppression, forms of captivity that are created by a society that Jesus said, I need to break these things. And he does those throughout his life. So let's take a moment and ask ourselves, because I think this is one of the things that we're kind of struggling through with at this time. If we're to be about setting people free and overcoming injustice and all of that, what does that look like? Well, obviously, one of the things that we're seeing very clearly right now is lots of protest. And we need to understand that protest is a way of gaining attention to a topic. It doesn't fix the solution, but it raises awareness. That's how Martin Luther King, that's how Gandhi, that's how people today are using it, to raise awareness of a problem. It disrupts things to a point that someone has to be confronted with this truth. Jesus protested. When he walks in the temple and starts flipping over tables and chasing the animals and the money changers out, he's protesting that his house, which is his father's house, which is to be a house of prayer, has become a den of robbers. It's become an economic sanctuary, not a sanctuary for the soul. That was a protest. He was demonstrating that something was wrong and it needed to be changed. Now, did flipping over the tables change anything long term? No, it doesn't. And that's the thing. Protests don't change things long term in and of themselves. They do, however, when they lead to people recognizing a problem, and now they move to intervention and fixing it. That is, they take the next step and say, okay, how do we fix this? And we see Jesus intervening and fixing some of this oppression. He finds lepers, he heals them. He sets them free so they can be a part of society. He casts out demons so that people can have freedom. When they're hungry, he feeds them. He watches over them. He steps in and offers himself as a solution. That is what we need to be doing. Not just protesting, but now how do we begin to move forward and providing some real solutions and being a part of that solution to change the injustice, deliver the captives and the oppressed that we see. And that solution ultimately, of course, came through Jesus saying, I will show you the solution. I will end the law by fulfilling it, and I'll start a new covenant. So his death on the cross, his resurrection from the grave, his ascension into heaven, and the coming of the Holy Spirit is Jesus providing a solution to the spiritual oppression of the day, the sin oppression of the day, and then calling us to carry out dealing with the physical oppression, the social injustice, the economic injustice, the physical injustice that takes place in this world by living in the power of that Spirit, by living and following his teachings, which is part of the way he intervened. He said, okay, no, this is the way we need to do it. This is wrong. You've heard it said. I tell you this. He provided a new alternative to the way they lived. So he protested, yes. He intervened through his teachings and his healings and his service and called his disciples to do the same thing. Then, of course, he provided a solution, both in the ultimate spiritual side, but in the daily life side by commissioning his disciples to go and do what he had done. So we need to be the kind of people that says, okay, he is sending me to deliver the captives and to release those that are oppressed. How do I do that? I can raise awareness. I can intervene. I can help teach a new way. I can move forward by providing solutions. It's not a matter of just sitting back and saying, okay, God has set me free from my sins. He has done that. But when we look at the Gospel of Luke and the other Gospels, he does more than just preach freedom from sins. He does set the captives free, literally. He raises up the oppressed, literally. And he calls us as disciples to do that. That's what we see in the early church. That's what we see when Christians are at their best. They are giving people space to find freedom from their sin, yes, through Jesus Christ, absolutely. But also to find freedom from those physical things, those laws and those systems that bind them and oppress them here. True disciples are ones who hear the call that Jesus heard, which was to preach the good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set the captives free, to heal the blind so that they might see, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Today is that day. Can we be about that? When we do that with kindness and graciousness, when we bring that Jesus' grace and mercy, we are accomplishing his call. I hope this has helped you as you consider what does it mean to be captive and how do we get set free from oppression and how can we participate in that. We'll continue tomorrow as we look at helping the blind to see the acceptable year of the Lord. Until then, may you go in God's grace, God's peace, and the salvation of Jesus Christ. May the Holy Spirit hold you in his hand now and forever. Be kind, be safe, take care. God bless.